Today, the Tory party chairman on the ropes, proposals for menopause leave rejected, and Labour's row over trans rights. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti, Anoosh Chakelian of The New Statesman and Lara Spirit from The Times.
You're going to resign, Mrs Zahawi. You feel under pressure to resign, sir?
Can the Cabinet Minister with questions to answer over his tax affairs stay in the job?
Nadhim is certainly a very talented politician, but maybe he should temporarily recuse himself until this investigation is over.
I think it's reasonable that where there's an investigation, that the person concerned is allowed to continue serving while that investigation continues.
Criticism for the government as it rejects proposals for menopause leave.
Where is the commitment there to making sure that women's health and my personal interest, menopause, is a priority? It's not.
I welcome the government's invoking of Section 35 in this case, as the bill clearly conflicts with the Equality Act and would have repercussions for women across the UK.
And this Labour MP says her party has a woman problem. Is she right? Hello. Well, I want to start with a story that's being reported by the Sun newspaper today. So let's have a little look at this headline. It says, work till 68, millions to work longer as state pension age to be hiked under new government plans, what it means for you. So the story from the Sun suggesting the retirement age could rise to 68 sooner than currently is expected. So what I'd like to know from our panel is, when do you expect to retire, Tom Hunt?
I've got no idea. I suspect probably a very long time from now. And no decision's been made by government. They're under legal obligation to keep it under constant review.
So they're looking at it?
It is under review. It is something unsurprisingly, they're looking at. No decision's been made. And also my understanding is that if any decision were to be made on anything like this, I think it would only apply to people, say, below the age of 52. So I don't think this is something that, That's
quite a lot of people, though, that might be seeing themselves working longer.
I think my key point is I don't think this is something that those who are close to the current pension age need to worry about and be anxious about. I think there's lots of things to weigh up in terms of how society changing, life expectancy getting longer. But no decision's been made, and I'm sure the government will consider all the facts. Shami
Chakrabarti, when do you reckon that you'll be able to give up work?
I feel that today I'm the token, because of the agenda on the show, I'm the token sort of nearly 54.
Definitely not a token. Definitely not a token in that respect, Shami.
Who's in the menopause and might now have a change in her retirement age. Look, seriously, I have suspected for some years, of course, that the retirement age would gradually creep up because of an ageing population, though in some poorer parts of the country, life expectancy has actually come down in recent years, pretty shockingly. What I would say is this: it is one thing for us as middle-class professionals to sit here and say, yeah, I'm raring to go. I'm in the House of Lords over the way, where I see people in their 80s and some in their 90s.
Still going strong.
Fit as a fiddle, enjoying work. But if you are doing back-breaking, laborious work, it's a different story. But the crucial thing for me is, what is the deal with people? If you are going to be working longer, harder, for more taxation, less remuneration, are you going to be looked after in your older
so your
age?
Pension, when you get it's got to be worth it.
Not just that, your social care. There's got to be a bit of a deal with people. Don't just tell them that this tough working life is going on forever, but there's nothing for you at the end of it.
Anoosh, do you feel there's a sense of inevitability about this, that we're all going to actually end up working longer, like it or not? That's the direction it's going.
That's almost how I feel. I can't imagine myself ever retiring because of covering these stories every few years.
Never retiring. Blimey.
Not that that's what I want, but I do think the issue here is that even if you raise the retirement age, are people necessarily going to work to it? Because we know that this this particular change, if it comes in, would affect people in their early 50s the most. Who's leaving the workforce at a record rate? People 50 and over, you know, and that's really one of the big problems that the government needs to solve before perhaps tinkering around with the retirement age. I was looking into the figures, and it's people aged 50 to 54 who say stress is their main reason for leaving work early since the pandemic. So that's clearly a problem with working conditions, like Shami was talking about.
Lara, I think you are the youngest member of our panel. I mean, are you staring away, looking at retirement ebbing away from you? Do you think you're ever going to get there?
Yeah, I would imagine you're looking at the demographic changes and expecting that probably you will be retiring slightly later. But I think it's interesting, we talk a lot about the generational challenges that the Tory vote is facing at the moment. And actually, if you look at the current polling, the group most likely to be abandoning the Tory party since 2019 is actually those in the kind of 50s. So actually, I think it will be very difficult to see a situation where the Conservative Party, ahead of the next election, or Rishi Sunak thinks that one of the most viable policies they should be going forward would be this retirement age policy. I think electorally that's going to be very difficult for them.
Just on that point, Tom, you would have had a lot of that conversation, not just about this potentially, but about housing, people getting on the housing ladder. There's a generational issue for your party. Do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I mean, the evidence in the polling bears it out. There's no point me saying that there isn't a challenge there. It clearly is, and I think that home ownership's part of that. I think that, you know, we've got a lot of young people leaving. Many of the young people who go to university leave university significant amounts of debt, which makes it harder for them to get a mortgage, to get onto a property ladder. And they look at the future and they don't see any realistic pathway for them getting, you know, owning their own assets. And I think, you know, if you've got a diminishing number of people owning their own assets, that is not likely to be a good thing for the Conservative Party, and we need to try and address that.
There was something, Anish, that you mentioned that I just want to touch upon, and that's people coming out of the workforce, leaving the workforce over 50. And actually, the Women and Equalities Committee, this is Parliament's Women and Equalities Committee, says one thing that could be pushing women out of work is a lack of support around the menopause. And in fact, there is a story in the news about this today. Let's have a look at a BBC News headline which says a menopause leave trial has been rejected by ministers. So this is the idea of actually giving people some time off to deal with the menopause. Anish, you mentioned this issue. Do you think the government's response on this is the right one?
I actually think it's probably the wrong response because of this problem that has emerged since the pandemic of over 50s leaving the workforce early. You know, we've got worker shortages in so many industries now. So I do think it's on the government to create as many conditions as possible to keep people in work. And actually, you know, it is women of menopausal age who are the largest growing group in the workforce. They're staying in work longer than ever before. But actually, they're now leaving because of the way that their menopausal symptoms aren't supported in the workplace. So anything to keep them on that track of staying in work would be helpful for the government. I think this is often dismissed as a women's issue, as if that's not important, but it's also an economic issue.
In terms of keeping people in the workforce and getting them going. I mean, Tom, what about that point? Because we know the government's trying to encourage over 50s back into work. Perhaps this is something they should be looking at. Yeah,
and it's a significant issue. It's an important issue, and I think it's one what I want to learn more about and the impact of it. And you know, certainly something I'm happy to talk to government about.
Shami?
So 3 things, as the expert. One, this is a tin-eared response from the government, and they ought to think again. Even amongst Conservative women, like I think Caroline Noakes, who we heard from before, this is a very tin-eared response to a very well-thought-out report, I thought. The second thing, and this relates to your previous point, women of my sort of age, friends of mine, colleagues of mine, are not only having to cope with menopause, they're having to take on significant caring responsibilities for their older relatives, their parents, as well. It's a double whammy. It's a pincer movement. It's really hard. Final point. One of the government's arguments for dismissing these recommendations was they thought there would be unintended consequences and people would discriminate against men. Don't be silly. I've been learning about men's mental health problems, and that doesn't make me insensitive to women's problems and vice versa. We can all be more sensitive in the workplace. So I really urge the government to think again.
Tom, you were nodding along to a lot of what Shami was saying there. Do you agree?
Well, I think there's some nuances to this debate and some complexity to it, and I think that, you know, the government need to take on on board as many of these as possible. But no, the comment about men's mental health is also very well made. I think that there is a problem in men not feeling able to talk about their mental well-being. I've spotted it in my constituency. There have been some attempts to try and address that, often by women who've actually set up clubs in my constituency to try and address specifically men's talk clubs, and but there's still quite a long way to go. I think it's men of a particular age and particular generation, and I think it's a real challenge. But look, I mean, I think we've got to be aware of these complexities and some of these differences, and I'll look into it more, and I'll talk to the government.
There we are. Lara, this certainly seems to be something we are talking about more, but do you think the policy making around this is keeping up, particularly around the menopause?
Well, it's interesting because the report was very detailed, and I think, like we've touched on, there were a number of detailed recommendations that you would have expected, I think, perhaps the government to have seized on at least some of them. But their response would be, we've got this women's NHS particular healthcare strategy. We're pushing that forward. We are taking a gender-sensitive approach to health, and we are listening to women's concerns about that. But I think quite apart from the merits of whether or not menopause should be a protected category or a number of the other responses.
That was one of the recommendations in the report.
One of the recommendations in this report. I think there will be questions about what the Conservative offering to women actually might be at the next election. I think we've seen a lot of coverage, particularly because there's Conservative divides over it at the moment on childcare. So, in a situation where we've got the second most expensive childcare in the OECD. Quite. Now, of course, Sunak is saying that despite Liz Truss's plans not being taken forward in full, that they're reviewing that there will be an offering on childcare. But in the interim, you have a situation where a number of Conservative MPs saying privately and publicly that they don't think there's enough of an offer on the table for women at the next election. And, I'm sure we'll talk about the supposed Labour problem with women, but actually, more women vote Labour. So it's kind of, than men do. So.
Tom, do you agree with that some of your colleagues are having those conversations? There needs to be an improved offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, those conversations are taking place. I think childcare, another issue of great importance, and we're going to have an offering on that. And I think, yeah, I agree with that. I'm not going to disagree with any of those points.
There we are, an outbreak of consensus very early in the programme. Let's see if it continues throughout. But I want to talk now about Nadhim Zahawi, who is, of course, the Conservative Party chairman. There's been a lot of active discussion about Mr Zahawi's tax affairs in recent days. Have a little listen to the Prime Minister when he was asked about this a week or so ago in Prime Minister's Questions in the House of Commons. This is what he said a week ago.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend has already addressed this matter in full, and that's nothing more that I can add.
Then yesterday, Rishi Sunak said this.
Integrity and accountability is really important to me, and clearly in this case there are questions that need answering, and that's why I've asked our independent advisor to get to the bottom of everything, to investigate the matter fully and establish all the facts and provide advice to me on Nadhim Zahawi's compliance with the ministerial code.
So, a change of tack from the Prime Minister, who initially said he thought the matter had been addressed in full. Then there are questions to answer. We do know now that there is going to be an investigation. You heard Rishi Sunak talking about it there, into what exactly has happened with Nadhim Zahawi. But Tom Hunt, do you think he can stay in his job while that investigation is carried out?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think it's a decision for the government to make. I think it's right that it's being investigated. I think clearly over the last few days, some fragments of new information has come to light, which I think has justified this investigation. We've had a lot of people calling for a independent advisor to be appointed for a long time.
This is the Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial standards.
And we now have one, and they're getting to work and they're establishing all the facts, because none of us at the moment are aware of all the facts. Hopefully we will be after this investigation. But I think fragments of new facts have come out over the last few days, and I think there's enough questions there to absolutely justify an investigation, which is what's happening.
So you're right to say it is the government's decision as to whether the Conservative Party chairman keeps his job. But, for example, Caroline Noakes, your Conservative colleague, has said he should go while this is being looked at. So on principle, do you think he should stay or go while the investigation's carrying on?
You see, the unknown about this investigation is how long it's going to take. If the investigation takes a short period of time, then OK, it's probably manageable. But I think if it drags on for a long period of time, I think it presents challenges.
So it might be better if he stood aside.
Not least because the Conservative Party chairman is, required to have a very prominent...
Often known as the Minister for the Today programme, I think, because they have to be front-facing, and the idea is that he would be questioned about this. So perhaps he should step aside.
I think the key thing is that we get all of the facts, because I was in a urgent question that took place yesterday. There's a lot of heated views about it, but it's quite clear that no one was anywhere near to having all the facts. We've got to get all the facts. There are questions to answer, there's enough questions to answer to justify this investigation, and I think the Prime Minister's done the right thing in triggering it.
Lara, how worried do you think that Conservative MPs are about this, and about this, as Tom mentioned, potentially going on for some time?
I think Conservative MPs would probably be less worried, or the ones I've spoken to would be less worried if they felt that this was an isolated incident. But of course, this isn't the only formal probe that Rishi Sunak is facing at the moment. And for a leader that's come in on the basis of the standards clear up, saying professionalism, integrity and accountability are fundamental to what he wants his premiership in Downing Street to say, the fact that not only Nadhim Zahawi, but also Dominic Raab, his deputy, is facing a formal probe related to standards, I think makes it quite difficult for some MPs who are feeling a little bit frustrated when they talk to you about the fact that actually this was supposed to mark a real gear change for the Conservative Party. This was supposed to lead to, headlines and different news stories that weren't solely focused on standards in number 10 and around the cabinet table. But actually, it's proving doggedly hard for Rishi Sunak to avoid that now.
Tom, on that point,
I think that the Prime Minister, came into office at a time where we'd had months of not great things, frankly, when it comes to standards and ethics and everything else. And he is determined to mark a change. And I think the key thing now is how he responds to situations as they arise. With this situation, I think he's done the right thing in triggering an investigation. I mean, some of these things we've seen in the media over the last few days to do with standards, they've been related to previous administrations. In fact, actually, I think that...
But it's all the same party, isn't it? I mean, let's be frank.
But we're talking about, the current Prime Minister and the comment he made outside number 10, where he spoke to the public and said he wants his administration to be marked by those values. And that's what we're discussing right now. And I think that, looking at his record, I think he's responded in the right way. I don't think, sacking someone on the back of media reports and fragments of facts is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do is to use that independent advisor that the opposition have been calling as appointed for quite a long time and get all the facts and complete the full investigation, and we'll do that. And hopefully it's soon.
Shami, that is right, isn't it? The Labour have been calling for this person to be put in place. So is it right, as Tom says, there should be a process, should be allowed to get on and have a look at it?
Well, there should always be a process and there should always be fair investigations, but they can also be used to kick things into the long grass. I take no pleasure in this story because it's not just bad for the Conservative Party, it's actually bad for trust in government, trust in institutions and public life in this country. I think that Mr Zahawi should, of his own accord, say, I am standing aside whilst this matter is regularised because I care about my party and I care about integrity in public life. That is what he should do. Similarly, Mr Raab, who's been accused of pretty serious bullying by civil servants on his staff in more than one job, should do the same. And you know what? It will create an impetus for the investigations to be dealt with more swiftly because they'll certainly be keen to clear their names. But I really do think that this is beginning to... I take your point about this is a new administration, but the public just see it as a Conservative government in continuity.
I think it becomes a slightly dangerous precedent if we have a situation where if a complaint or 2 or 3 complaints are made about a particular cabinet minister, before we even know the validity of those complaints, there's a precedent that they have to stand down whilst that investigation takes place.
No, I totally agree.
Because I think if that happened for one, it would set a precedent.
I totally agree, but this is more than just a bit of knockabout being chucked across the House of Commons chamber. We've got journalists who've been threatened with lawyers. We've got doubling down over the tax arrangements. We're talking about millions and millions of pounds that were carelessly overlooked. This is on his own case.
I think there's a point where we can probably reach some agreement here, which is that my desire is for this investigation to be completed as quickly as possible. I absolutely don't want it to be kicked into the long grass. I think it's a distraction from the things that most of my voters want to talk about and are concerned about. Cost of living, the NHS, some issues, immigration, for example. And those 5 priorities the Prime Minister outlined not long ago. Those are the things I want him to be dedicated to solving, and the things that I think as MPs we want to be dedicated to playing a role in solving as well.
Anoush.
But it's not just, I don't think this is just an issue with the last administration, because Sunak himself has questions to answer. Why did he give Zahawi this job? There have been questions about his tax affairs since 2017. Rishi Sunak's supposed to be the numbers man who pores over spreadsheets for fun. Why didn't he have the details on this? Why is he only calling this investigation?
Let Tom answer that.
My understanding is that before the Prime Minister offered Nadhim Zahawi the position of party chairman, he did ask for Cabinet Officer's advice. And my understanding is the Cabinet Office said there was no reason not to appoint Nadhim Zahawi. So, I think that's evidence that the Prime Minister followed the correct procedure.
But is there a question here about judgment? Because it isn't just this question of Nadhim Zahawi. We also had the questions around the reappointment of Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, after she had to resign from her role. You know, how much can he distance himself from previous administrations if this stuff carries on?
No, I think it's quite clear, you know, and I was in the House of Commons chamber on a few occasions where the Home Secretary was subject to questions from the opposition, that there is a significant number of people who would like the Home Secretary gone because they don't agree with her politics. And I think a lot of that heat on the Home Secretary was driven by opposition to her views on immigration.
And you hear here Tom saying that some of these things have been inherited from a previous administration. We know that that is true of Rishi Sunak. But do you think there is a way for him to draw a line and move on without shedding senior cabinet ministers?
I don't think so. I think it would help him if he got rid of people when they're under investigation for things like this, not least because, you know, if you put the whole ethics debate aside, Nadhim Zahawi is supposed to be the person who goes on to those programmes like the Today programme to, you know, make the government's case. He's got a party chairman role and minister without portfolio. He can't do that without being asked about this now. And his ministerial colleagues can't go on anything without being peppered with questions about it. So it's just a problem for the government's reputation. It's like a running sore. So I do think the only way around it is to get rid of people swiftly. And I know that may sound unfair if an investigation is underway and could be concluded swiftly as well. I do agree with you that it should be fast.
Lara?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very difficult to see how this is an issue that goes away. And I think, I mean, the shift in moving towards this investigation means that people can come on the airwaves and when they're asked about this from the government say, I'm not going to comment on this because I'm waiting for the outcome of the investigation. That doesn't mean for Rishi Sunak and Number 10, though, that issue isn't going to be raised at all. And it doesn't mean that it's not an ongoing issue without any political cost for them either.
OK, I just want to have another look at a story that's in actually the front page of the Daily Mail today. Take a look at this. What the hell is the West waiting for? Now, this is an article that's written by none other than Boris Johnson, who's writing in the Daily Mail, urging Western leaders to be more decisive about their intervention on Ukraine. I mean, talking about things not going away, Boris Johnson's not going away, is he, Tom Hunt? Some of your colleagues even want him to come back. Do you think that that's a viable proposition? Is that something you would welcome?
I think the fact here is that Boris Johnson continues to be a member of Parliament, and he's also a former Prime Minister.
But not every member of the Parliament gets front pages and trips to Ukraine, do they?
He's a former Prime Minister, and he's a current member of Parliament who feels very strongly about the situation in Ukraine. And he's expressing his views about what he thinks should happen with regards to the West supporting Ukraine. And actually, as it happens, his views I agree with. I think he's legitimately entitled. And I think every time a Prime Minister makes a former Prime Minister makes an intervention on something like the Ukraine, it's some kind of indicative of some kind of manoeuvring.
But there are colleagues of yours who do want to say and have said publicly they'd like to see Boris Johnson make a comeback. So this isn't just a sort of indication of him on manoeuvres per se. There are people in the party that would like to see it. Is that something you would
I have
like?
to say, I've seen some of the media coverage in the weekend papers about, you know, plots and everything else. All I can say is I haven't got any sense of any plots in the parliamentary party right now with regards to the former Prime Minister. Maybe that means that I'm just not observant enough, but I think maybe I'm just, you know, maybe I need to be a bit more on the ball. But generally, I'm actually in the tea room quite a lot. I tend to talk
and you're not hearing it, is what you're saying.
I talk quite a lot to my colleagues. Look, when Liz Truss resigned, there was clearly, you know, a lot of colleagues went public saying they'd like Boris to come back. There's 350 odd Conservative members of Parliament. You know, we're going to have different views. But generally, my experience is a parliamentary party right now is very united behind the current Prime Minister. And that's truthful from me. That is my experience.
Well, look, he is a very charming advocate for his party, and he's doing very well in all sorts of difficult terrain today. But it's not just the parliamentary party, is it? It's also the Tory party membership. And whenever I see polls of them, it seems that Boris Johnson is still an incredibly popular figure with that membership. All I would say is that it's not a conspiracy, it's not a plot if it's in plain view. Boris Johnson was once a huge admirer of Winston Churchill, but he actually became a pupil of Donald Trump. And I think both of these gentlemen have significant egos and ambitions, and I don't believe that Boris Johnson is finished with Number 10 yet.
Lara, what are you hearing on this? Because you're in touch with a lot of Conservative Conservative Party members, grassroots and otherwise.
Well, it's interesting when you speak to friends of Boris Johnson MPs who remained loyal to him even in the kind of darkest final days of his premiership. There are a number of them who would love to see him in number 10, except that right now would not be the right circumstances for him to try and do that, and also understand that the electoral circumstances mean that actually probably the best bet for the Conservative Party right now would be to get behind Rishi Sunak. However, I think there's a distinction that you should make between, Boris Johnson doesn't need to make a comeback in order to be damaging for Rishi Sunak or to undermine him. And, his friends have been quite open about the fact that he feels that on Ukraine, on levelling up, and on Brexit, he is very prepared to prove a kind of obstinate obstructionist force for Rishi Sunak's government if he doesn't feel that the government is taking the right position on these things. And so I think Ukraine is a good example of an intervention that he feels that he's well placed to make, and that it might be slightly difficult for Rishi Sunak. But I also think, coming up the tracks, the agreement on the protocol, if we see that could prove very
Northern
difficult.
Ireland Protocol, that's the bit of a trade deal with between...
That could be an intervention from Boris Johnson that you'd see that could prove very, very divisive and damaging for the parliamentary party if it doesn't go the way that Boris Johnson, might like it to. I think you could expect him to speak up on that, but also on other things around EU drive legislation, the plans to scrap getting rid of all of those before the end of the year. That's another issue that I think you could be prepared to hear Boris speak out about on that too. So I think there's a distinction between Boris saying I want to be Prime Minister again and saying I don't necessarily think I'm going to be Prime Minister in the next year or before the next general election, but that doesn't mean I'm going to provide a helping hand always to Rishi Sunak when it suits him.
I just want to show you another headline about Boris Johnson, which is in the papers today. This again from the Daily Mail. It says, Boris, it's nonsense to suggest that the BBC chairman knows about my finances. Just a bit of a reminder about the background to this, for those who perhaps haven't been following as closely as some of us. And this is because the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, did put in touch a distant cousin of Boris Johnson with the Prime Minister when he was Prime Minister to arrange some sort of loan facility for around £800,000. And that's Boris Johnson saying the BBC chairman knew nothing about the details of my finances, and Richard Sharp himself says once he'd made that introduction, he effectively excused himself from the process. But, Anoush, it shows that there are still questions about Boris Johnson's time in office that are dogging him now.
Exactly. So there's now 2 investigations into this Richard Sharp story, and there's also the Privileges Committee hearings coming up into whether or not Boris Johnson misled Parliament over Partygate. And so for any MPs in your party, and you do say that there are some who want to see Boris Johnson come back either now or sometime in the future, this just proves that there will always be something. There is always something lurking with Boris Johnson. There's always a story chasing him like this. And we saw it when he was Prime Minister, and like you say, it hasn't gone away.
Tom, that's right, isn't it? Do you agree?
Look, I mean, he's a very charismatic figure, and he's got a presence. I go back to my point though. I simply don't agree in a lot of the media analysis I've seen over the last few weeks that is making it seem like there's some kind of massive plot. I don't agree that there is. In terms of the privileges, I mean, I think it's extraordinary that it's taking so long.
I think it starts in March. Is that right? We're expecting it to get underway in March.
I just think it's amazing that it's taking so long. Really, I mean, I think back to how long ago it was that it was originally Parliament had that vote on it, and it was ages ago, and I can't believe they're still.
I do think you've got a point about these various inquiries and things taking too long, and it's either long grass or for the innocent, it's hanging over them. Yep. But this isn't just about corruption or smelly loans. It's about a cost of living crisis where nurses are going to food banks, and we're seeing stories every day about ministers and former ministers who are multi-millionaires.
I do think
Briefly, Tom.
There's a point on the privileges investigation. I think there is a significant difference between deliberately misleading Parliament and inadvertently. And I think that I'm not sure whether the current investigation...
I'm sure that's something that we will come back to when that privileges investigation gets underway and, of course, does report whenever that might be. But I want to move on because it isn't just the Conservative Party that, of course, has division in its ranks. The Labour Party does too. Last week, the Labour MP Rosie Duffield stood up in support of the government's intervention in blocking the Scottish Gender Reform Bill. This was a bill that was passed by the Scottish Parliament to make it easier for people to change their legal sex. But the Westminster government used something called Section 35 of the Scotland Act, which effectively allows them to veto that. Have a listen to what Rosie Duffield, the Labour MP, had to say.
I welcome the government's invoking of Section 35 in this case, as the bill clearly conflicts with the Equality Act and would have repercussions for women across the UK. Does the Secretary of State recognise the strength of feeling amongst women, women's rights groups and activists in Scotland that this bill seeks to allow anyone a tool to legally self-identify as either sex and therefore enter all spaces, including those necessarily segregated by sex, such as domestic violence settings, changing rooms and prisons. And given the previous UQ, does he not understand how vitally important this is at the moment?
So that was Rosie Duffield there. You can hear the reaction from some of the benches. And Rosie Duffield herself said that she was shouted down by some Labour colleagues for sharing her views in Parliament. And in fact, later that week, she wrote a piece for the online website Unheard. Have a little look at the headline to that Rosie Duffield piece. It says, "The Labour Party has a woman problem." And in that piece, she goes on to talk about her own experience of having been in an abusive relationship, something she has spoken about before. And then she says one of the traits of being in an abusive relationship is stonewalling. The abuser will go quiet for days on end. She goes on to say, "What I feel now, after 6 years of being cold-shouldered by the Labour Party, conjures memories of how I felt in that abusive relationship." So that's a quote from that Rosie Duffield article. Shami, do you agree that Labour's got a woman problem?
Well, I think there are at least three separate but related issues that come out of this story, and I read Rosie's piece in Unheard with some sadness. The first is that I'm afraid we are still in a very misogynistic society, and we're not where I thought we would be, at this moment in the 21st century. That's not the Labour Party, that's not the police force, that's not the Tory Party. That is Britain, I'm afraid, and the Labour Party is going to have its share of sexism and misogyny.
And do you think Keir Starmer's doing enough about it? Because Rosie Duffield's suggesting he's not.
Well, you can never do enough about it. We should certainly do more. The second point is the point about the shouting in the chamber, and Rosie has been very brave about her past as a survivor of abuse in an intimate relationship. And, there are people who come into politics with trauma, and there are all sorts of triggers, and colleagues should be kinder to each other. They should be kinder to each other across the chamber, and they should certainly be kinder to each other even within parties. That said, on the issue of trans people's rights, I think Rosie and I disagree. But we ought to be able to disagree well. And I think that on the substantive issue, we can make sure that people are safe in prisons. I shouldn't be in a cell with a white supremacist, but that doesn't mean we have racially segregated prisons. There are people of goodwill can deal with these issues, but the shouting in the chamber and on social media is not helping anyone, let alone the 0.5% of the population who are very vulnerable trans people.
So firstly, I'd say I'm always very careful when I comment on these issues because it's a very sensitive topic. I happen to agree with the government's position on this, but I don't. I think we all need to be very careful when we engage in this debate. But I mean, it's important. There's a Rosie Duffield situation, but there's also Miriam Cates, who's a colleague of mine,
who said that she had a bad experience in the chamber as well.
And you had a serious situation where you had a Labour MP, Lloyd Russell Moore, I think it was. It was
Lloyd Russell Moore, that's right.
And he came across pretty much to our side, and he sat down, aggressively staring really close by to my female colleague. I thought who felt it incredibly uncomfortable. He's since put out a statement defending it, but ultimately people can watch that encounter and they can come to their own conclusion.
I just want to let people at home know that Miriam Cates is on the programme tomorrow, so it may be something that she talks about herself.
But in terms of the Rosie Duffield situation, we've had this whole situation with Starmer's director of communications, where he seems to have said where he's made a series of comments that have been proven to be factually untrue in relation to Rosie Duffield, saying that he hadn't spoken badly about her, and the evidence now would suggest that he did. And I think that but there's some serious points here.
I just want to get Shami's response to that, because this is the allegation there's been briefing from within the Labour Party against Rosie Duffield.
Well, if there has been briefing against a Labour MP, whatever their views on whatever issue, that is not to be encouraged. I condemn that. If that is the case, it is wrong. It does tend to happen sometimes in politics, and I'm really against off-the-record briefings, whichever party they come from. On Lloyd Russell Moore, I got in touch with him before I came on this show because I read Rosie's piece, and what he said to me was that he was mortified, and he's apologised to Miriam Cates. He felt that tempers were getting high in the chamber, and he certainly doesn't want to exacerbate anyone's trauma. Now, that's what he said to me.
What he actually said, he made a point of order about this in Parliament, and what he actually said was, I recognise I failed to control that passion during what was an emotional debate. I should have expressed my deep disagreement on what I believe is an abhorrent view in a more appropriate way. And it's also worth just saying, so people at home know, we did offer the Labour Party the chance for somebody to come on and discuss this, the allegations of briefing against Rosie Duffield, but they chose not to. But
I find this point about him feeling passionate about it a little bit. I mean, there's been all sorts of things that I felt passionate about in the House of Commons chamber, and
you're obviously the nicest man in the House of Commons, but
well, I'm in a good mood today.
It's very shouty. This is a general point. It is a very shouty chamber. I mean, it's not the sedate. It's not the sedate chamber that I'm in, but on this trans rights issue, it sometimes gets a bit shouty even there.
The point that Rosie Duffield's making, Anoush, is that she doesn't think, as Shami's saying there should be, there is space within the party to have a disagreement on the substance of this. Do you think that that's right?
I think this is a really difficult issue for Keir Starmer. You see how much he and others struggled when they were out on the airwaves answering these questions. You know, what is a woman?
What is a woman? What is a woman?
Yeah, it's
one word answer, yes or no.
Exactly.
Is this a woman? Yeah.
Yeah. Stupid questions, but things that, you know, are going to come up for them if they get, you know, mired in this debate. And that's a problem, because they want to try and avoid it, because there are, as Rosie Duffield has written in her piece, there are clearly divisions within the party on this, within the wider left as well in the UK. And so they want to try and avoid talking about it. And I think what's interesting from that briefing that surfaced that Tom mentioned is there was a suggestion that this wasn't politically damaging to them. And I think that's how they want to try and keep it. That's the thing that they care most about. In terms of how it's seen publicly, in terms of how the debate is seen publicly in the party. But I do agree, it's the culture within the House of Commons.
In people's families up and down the country, people are rubbing along together. Different generations are learning from each other about the experience of feeling that you weren't born in the sex that you were meant to be. And if people can be sensitive in their families, we can do a better job in our national politics.
Lara?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the divisions in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party on this issue are quite interesting. In the Labour Party, if you look at those 11 MPs who back the SNP gender reforms in that debate, they cut across quite interesting ideological age divides that you don't necessarily see in other issues. So I don't think it's an issue that's going away. But I also would say that I don't think it's necessarily the easy win for the Conservative Party that some commentators often assume. Like, this is a very difficult and politically complex issue. And I mean, there's been some ambiguity even from the Conservative front bench. You saw Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, appear to suggest that she felt 16 was an OK age to be able to make a decision like this. And actually, privately, when you talk to some MPs, they say we're slightly wary of looking like the nasty party if we row in too heavily on this issue. And actually, if you look at the government's line on this particular Scotland case, very keen to assert that it's a constitutional issue, very keen to speak about it in the context of the wider equalities legislation. And so I do think there's a sense in which we should also appreciate that for the Conservatives, it's not without kind of political risks either.
Tom, there are divisions in your party on this, as Lara said, aren't there?
Not to the same extent as the Labour Party. I think the vast majority, like extremely 90% of the colleagues, I believe, were supportive of the government's move on this.
Well, the move is about devolution. The move is not about trans rights. I think that's very. I think you need to be careful about.
Well, I think we need to be clear here that there is a position that the SNP have adopted that we believe has implications for the Equality Act, and we believe it could put some women at risk. And I think it's clearly, this whole topic of whether we think 16 is old enough. 16
I think it's very important not to weaponise these issues about 0.5% of the population.
I think having a legitimate debate about something and how vulnerable people could be impacted by legislation isn't weaponising.
Well, as a woman,
I think it's a legitimate debate.
I'm grateful for your sensitivity towards my vulnerability.
So am I not allowed to have a conversation with you?
Of course you are, but I think we should also think about 0.5% of the population who are not involved in constitutional rows about Scotland and Westminster and are just caring about living a happy, healthy life.
OK. I'm sure it's something we will come back to, but I want to talk about something else now, which is one of the many pretty hefty bits of legislation that's currently grinding its way through Parliament. The Public Order Bill is back in the House of Lords next week. Have a look at this headline in The Guardian, which is from earlier this month. Rishi Sunak plans to crack down on go-slow protest used by Just Stop Oil. It's one of the measures that's being proposed as part of this bill to to, as that says there, to stop or limit the protests that we've seen. I think we've got some images of one of those Go Slow protests that we can show you now. This was a Just Stop Oil protest in London. You can see there people are effectively walking slowly through the streets to slow the traffic down. I mean, Tom, when you look at that, what's so bad about that? Why does the Prime Minister need to crack down on that?
What's so bad about that? The frequency of some of those protests, the way, for example, some of the major road networks been impacted by those types of protests. I mean, I've had a large number of constituents contact me who actually have been caught up and very much disrupted by some of that behaviour. So what is so bad about that? What's so bad about that is it will severely impact the day-to-day lives of millions of people up and down the country.
Shami?
Well, the police have a lot of power already, including to put restrictions on processions and assemblies. I don't actually think there's pretty much anything in this new bill, as it was before last Sunday, that was necessary. What was interesting, the Sunday before last, was a press release went out from Number 10, not the Home Office, in the middle of the afternoon. And by the way, this is the day before PC Carrick was going to be convicted of his 49 offences. And there was no amendment attached to it, and it just said, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak backs the police's crackdown on protest. And journalists were calling me up. There was no amendment in there. And now there's going to be a new definition of serious disruption that the government backs, which is more than minor hindrance.
I think so. So I was on the Bill Committee for the Public Order Act, and the police, Metropolitan Police, I think specifically, have asked for this clarification. They asked the Prime Minister for this clarification. The police have said this would be helpful. But ultimately, we've got to balance a right to protest with trying to minimise some of this serious disruption which has been caused.
Well, then we just need to have a definition of serious disruption, which is serious.
Mark Rowley, the Met Commissioner, has clarified that they asked for a clarification rather than new powers to crack down on protests. So they wanted legal clarity on the existing rules because they find it hard to balance those rights. It's very difficult for police officers.
Just one final point with 3 journalists in the room. Please let us remember Charlotte Lynch, who last autumn was arrested with her LBC insignia and her press card and detained in a police cell for 5 hours for conspiracy to cause a public nuisance. That was under the existing law. And I have tabled an amendment to this bill, which I hope that you and your colleagues will support, to give special protection to those observing protests,
Tom,
not even involved in the protests themselves.
I'll be very clear. I mean, I was part of voting on the public order bill and the police and crime before that, which was all connected to this. But yet we're continuing to see the images of huge disruption being caused, and it is very much a small minority who think they've got an unlimited right to cause mass disruption to the majority of the population.
But what about journalists getting
arrested? I do not agree with that. And we should legislate accordingly to ensure it doesn't happen.
And what about abuses of police power? What about Charlotte Lynch?
I just want to bring in Lara. I mean, the government clearly thinks that this is a popular move, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it, would they? But it isn't just about this, is it? We've also seen the minimum service level legislation when it comes to strikes. I mean, does it feel like this is something they are very deliberately taking action on?
It's interesting, the minimum service level comparison, because there's definitely that narrative of, rights of some people have to be balanced with other people. And in the cases of protests, you should have the right to protest, but you shouldn't have the right to protest if you're influencing other people's ability to be able to go about their day-to-day lives. And that's very similar rhetoric.
Or if you're noisy.
Or if you're... Well, and the more detail that we seem to see around this definition of serious disruption, the more amorphous it actually to some people does seem to become. So I think it will be a very difficult issue for them. One of the other interesting things about it, I think, is that if you look at the groups that this is designed to target, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, I think, sensing that the public aren't on board with their public disruption so much anymore, have actually come out and said, we're actually, irrespective of this legislation, going to target the kind of what they say is the perpetrators of...
Well, I think that they may... I think Just Stop Oil are planning to continue their approach.
The problem
is... It's very clear to me. When I see activists gluing themselves to the M25, etc., at various times, I haven't understood why why the police haven't been straight in there.
Well, there are existing powers, but the point is...
And they should use those powers.
They should, but instead, politicians give them more and more blank cheque, broader powers to be used and abused by accident and design. And we see a public order bill, every year, but when are we going to get a police vetting, training and discipline bill?
Well, there are conversations at the moment about improving police vetting processes after the Darragh case.
Conversations go on and on on, but we get more police powers
I think we've got to have
every year.
those. We've got to have those checks, and if there's an incident, it needs to be thoroughly investigated. But ultimately, I'm on the side of the majority of people who want to get to work in the morning, get their kids to school, and don't want to be disrupted by this extremely selfish money.
Anoush, it's another big bit of legislation. I mean, do you think we're actually ever going to see some of this come into law, come into being?
You know what? That's the thing. I mean, you talked about the repeated bits of legislation that are coming out. The idea of anti-strike laws. We had the Policing and Crime Act last year. We have the Public Order Bill this year. We have the Borders Bill. It doesn't seem to ever stop what the government wants to stop happening in society, and that makes them look weak. You can't legislate yourself out of a broken Britain, can you?
Well, there we are. It remains to be seen whether or not some of this legislation comes into law. We'll keep an eye on all of it as it makes its way through Parliament, and we'll come back to it, no doubt. But that's all from us for today. Thank you so much from our panel. Jo Coburn will be back tomorrow when she'll be Prime Minister's Questions here on Politics Live. See you later.